They kicked me out with $5. Now, they're begging me to save their business. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now, let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. I still remember the weight of that envelope in my hand. 23 years old, standing in the marble foyer of what used to be my home, clutching a manila envelope with my name scrawled across it in my stepfather's aggressive handwriting. Inside, a cashier's check for exactly $500 and a one-page letter that began, "By now you understand that your services are no longer required." Services, like I was the hired help. My mother stood behind Richard's shoulder, her manicured fingers twisted together, eyes fixed somewhere past my left ear. She couldn't look at me, not after what they'd accused me of, not after she'd chosen to believe him over her own son. "The money should be enough to get you started somewhere else," Richard said, adjusting his Hermes tie. "I think we've been more than generous considering." Considering what? Considering they'd blamed me for the missing $40,000 from the family construction business? Considering they'd decided I was a thief based on nothing more than Richard's suspicion and some convenient paperwork that had my signature forged on it? I wanted to laugh. $500. I'd helped build that business from the ground up during high school and college, working summers on job sites, learning every aspect of residential construction. I'd brought in 3 major contracts in the past year alone. And they were giving me $500 like severance pay for a temp job. "I didn't take the money," I said one last time. Richard's jaw tightened. "The books don't lie, Marcus. Your signature's on those withdrawal slips, because you forged it. Enough!" His voice cut through the foyer like a blade. "You're lucky we're not pressing charges. Take the money and go. Don't contact us again." My mother finally looked at me then, just for a second, and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Doubt? Regret? But it vanished as quickly as it came, and she turned away. I folded the envelope and slipped it into my jacket pocket. "You're making a mistake." "The only mistake," Richard said, "was trusting you in the first place." I walked out of that house with $500, a duffel bag of clothes, my beat-up Honda Civic, and a determination that burned in my chest like acid. I drove straight through the night from Sacramento to Los Angeles, because I couldn't stand to spend another minute in the same city as them. The first 6 months were brutal. I rented a studio apartment in Koreatown for $800 a month, more than my $500 would cover, obviously. I worked 3 jobs, morning shifts at a Starbucks in Beverly Hills, afternoon construction work when I could find it, and weekend shifts at a moving company. I ate ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. I slept on an air mattress I'd bought at Target for $39. But I had a plan. Every construction site I worked, every job I took, I was learning. Not just about building houses, I was learning about the business side, how contractors bid jobs, how they managed subcontractors, how they handled permits and inspections, how they dealt with suppliers. I took notes in a composition notebook I kept in my back pocket. At night, after my shifts, I'd go to the public library and research real estate development, property law, construction management software. I applied for every grant and scholarship I could find and managed to get into some evening business classes at UCLA Extension. I was exhausted all the time, but I was also alive in a way I'd never been before. For the first time in my life, everything I was building was mine. The breakthrough came in year 2. I was working a framing job in Brentwood when I started talking to the homeowner, a tech executive named David Chen, who was renovating a 1960s ranch. He was frustrated with his general contractor cost overruns, missed deadlines, poor communication. We got to talking during my lunch breaks, and I started making suggestions. Small things at first. Better scheduling of the electrical and plumbing rough-ins, a more efficient layout for the kitchen renovation, ways to save money on materials without sacrificing quality. David was impressed enough to offer me a side job managing the project directly. I took vacation time from my other jobs and spent 2 weeks turning his renovation around. We finished under budget and ahead of schedule. He paid me $5,000 and, more importantly, referred me to 3 of his neighbors who were planning their own projects. That was the beginning of Chen Associates Construction Management. Yes, David became my first business partner. He handled the business development and client relationships, while I managed the actual construction. We started small kitchen remodels, bathroom renovations, room additions. But we did quality work, we communicated clearly with our clients, and we always delivered on time and under budget. By year 3, we were handling whole house renovations. By year 4, we'd moved into custom home construction. By year 5, we were developing our own properties buying lots, designing homes, building and selling them. David's tech connections gave us access to clients who wanted smart homes with all the latest automation features. My construction background meant we could deliver on their visions without the massive cost overruns that plagued most custom builders. I remember the first time I walked into a bank to discuss a construction loan, and the loan officer recognized my company name. Chen Associates, she said, scrolling through her computer. You guys have an excellent reputation. What can we do for you? What they could do for me was approve a $2 million loan to develop a small subdivision in Culver City. 6 custom homes, each one sold before we broke ground. By year 7, I'd bought out David's share of the business and rebranded as Marcus Cole Development. David wanted to return to tech full-time, and I wanted complete control over my company's direction. We parted on excellent terms. He's still one of my closest friends and biggest advocates. I started thinking bigger. Mixed-use developments, affordable housing projects that actually looked good and felt livable, sustainable building practices that didn't cost a fortune. I hired architects, engineers, project managers, people who were smarter than me in their specialties, but who shared my vision of building things that mattered. The recognition came gradually. An award from the LA Business Journal for Emerging Developer of the Year, a feature in Architectural Digest about one of our residential projects, speaking engagements at construction and development conferences. I was invited to join boards and committees. I started getting calls from investors who wanted to partner with me on bigger projects. 10 years after leaving Sacramento with $500, I was worth 8 figures. My company had developed over 300 units of housing, from luxury custom homes to affordable apartments. I owned a penthouse in downtown LA, drove a Tesla Model S, and had a wardrobe full of custom suits. But more than the money or the toys, I had something Richard had tried to take away from me. Respect. People knew my name in the industry. When Marcus Cole Development bid on a project, people paid attention. I tried not to think about Sacramento. I tried not to think about my mother or Richard or the family business I'd helped build. But sometimes, late at night in my penthouse, looking out at the city lights, I'd wonder what they were doing, whether they ever thought about me, whether they ever realized their mistake. I found out on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in my office reviewing plans for a mixed-use development in Santa Monica when my assistant buzzed me. Marcus, there's a woman on line 2 who says she's your mother. She sounds upset. My mother. I hadn't spoken to her in 10 years. Hadn't even known if she was still alive, though I supposed I could have found out easily enough if I'd wanted to. I stared at the blinking light on my phone for 30 seconds before picking up. Hello, Mom. Marcus. Her voice was smaller than I remembered. Tired. I wasn't sure you'd take the call. I wasn't sure I would either. What's wrong? A pause, then. It's Richard. We're in trouble, Marcus. Real trouble. I leaned back in my chair. What kind of trouble? The business is, and it's falling apart. We lost 3 major contracts last year. There was a lawsuit a house collapsed during construction because of faulty foundation work. The insurance didn't cover everything, and we've been hit with liens and judgment. Her voice broke slightly. We're going to lose everything. The business, the house, everything. I said nothing. Marcus, I know. I know we hurt you. I know we were wrong. But you're family. You're successful now. I've seen the articles about your company. Would you consider helping us? Maybe a loan or advice or How did you know about my company? I've been following your career for years. I'm proud of you, Marcus. So proud. The words I'd wanted to hear for a decade, and they felt hollow. Too little, too late. Where's Richard in all this? I asked. He doesn't know I'm calling. He's too proud. But Marcus, he's not the same man. The stress has broken him. He barely leaves the house anymore. He knows he made mistakes, but he won't admit them. Not out loud. I looked out my office window at the construction site across the street, where one of my crews was putting the finishing touches on a 40-unit apartment complex. Good, honest work. The kind of work I'd learned to love on Richard's job sites before everything went wrong. I need to think about this, I said finally. Of course. Marcus, I'll call you back. I hung up and sat in my office for an hour. Not moving, just thinking. 10 years of silence. 10 years of building a life without them. And now they needed me. I could have ignored the call. Could have changed my number and never looked back. But there was something in my mother's voice that I recognized. The same desperation I'd felt that day with the envelope, standing in their foyer with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. I called my assistant. Cancel my afternoon meetings. I need to take a trip. The drive to Sacramento felt longer than it used to. I took Highway 5 straight up the Central Valley, past the same truck stops and farm towns I'd driven past 10 years ago, in my Honda Civic. This time I was in a BMW 7 Series, wearing a $2,000 suit, but the nervousness in my stomach felt exactly the same. I pulled up in front of the house, my former home, and sat in the car for several minutes. The place looked smaller than I remembered. The landscaping was overgrown. The paint on the shutters was peeling. There was a beat-up pickup truck in the driveway that I didn't recognize. My mother answered the door before I could knock. She looked older, grayer, more fragile than I'd expected. But her eyes were the same, and when she saw me, they filled with tears. Marcus. Mom. We stood there for a moment, not quite knowing how to greet each other. Finally, she stepped aside and gestured me in. The house felt different. Smaller, shabbier. The furniture was the same, but everything looked worn down. There were stacks of papers on every surface bills, legal documents, notices from creditors. Richard's in the den, she said. He might not be happy to see you. I didn't come here to make him happy. She led me through the living room I'd once known so well, past the family photos that still hung on the walls. I noticed they'd taken down the pictures that included me. Richard was sitting in his leather recliner, but he looked nothing like the confident, intimidating man who'd kicked me out of this house. He'd lost weight. His hair had gone completely gray. He was wearing a stained t-shirt and old jeans, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked up when we entered the room, and I saw the exact moment he registered who I was. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, embarrassment, and finally, something that might have been fear. What's he doing here? He asked my mother. I called him, she said quietly. I told you not to... Richard. My voice was calm, controlled. Mom tells me you're having some problems. He stared at me for a long moment. I could see him taking in my appearance, the expensive suit, the confidence, the way I carried myself now. So different from the young man he'd dismissed 10 years ago. We don't need your help, he said finally. I looked around the room, at the stacks of bills and legal papers, at the notice of foreclosure proceedings that was sitting right on top of the pile on his desk, at the man who'd once held so much power over my life, now broken and defensive in his shabby recliner. Actually, I said, it looks like you do. Get out, he said, but there was no force behind it. I sat down on the sofa without being invited. Tell me about the collapsed house. Richard's jaw tightened, but my mother answered. It was a foundation issue. The soil tests were wrong, or we don't know exactly what happened. But the house shifted during construction and partially collapsed. No one was hurt, thank God, but the homeowner sued. The insurance company denied the claim, and you're facing bankruptcy. Richard glared at me. You always thought you were so smart. I was smart enough not to cut corners on foundation work, I said. What happened, Richard? Did you try to save money by skipping the proper soil analysis? Did you pour concrete before the inspector signed off? Did you use the wrong grade of rebar? Shut up. It was the soil analysis, wasn't it? I remember you always said those reports were just expensive guesswork. But I also remember telling you that foundation problems could destroy an entire project. That was back when you still pretended to listen to my opinions. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've built over 300 units in the past 10 years, Richard. Everything from luxury custom homes to affordable housing projects. I've never had a foundation failure because I never skipped the soil analysis. Ever. My mother looked back and forth between us. Marcus, please, we need... What do you need? I asked, still looking at Richard. Money? I've got money. Connections. I know every major contractor, supplier, and inspector in California. Expertise? I've forgotten more about construction than Richard ever knew. Richard's face was flushed now. You little... But here's the thing, I continued. 10 years ago, when I needed help, when I needed someone to believe in me, when I needed family to stand by me, where were you? You threw me out with $500 and a forged signature on some paperwork. You stole from us. I never stole anything, and you know it. I stood up, and Richard shrank back in his chair. You needed a scapegoat for your own mismanagement, and I was convenient. Young, naive, trusting, easy to blame. That's not... Did you ever even investigate? Did you ever ask yourself who else had access to that account? Did you ever consider that maybe, just maybe, your stepson, who'd been working his ass off for your business, wasn't actually a thief? The room was silent. My mother was crying quietly. Richard was staring at his hands. I know it was your business partner, I said, Jim Henderson. He was embezzling from you for months, maybe years. Small amounts at first, then bigger ones. He needed my signature on those withdrawal slips to make it look legitimate, so he forged it. Badly, I might add. But you never even looked closely enough to notice that the handwriting was wrong. Richard looked up sharply. How do you... Because Jim tried the same thing with a contractor friend of mine in LA 3 years ago. Got caught that time, though. Turns out he'd been running the same scam for years, moving from business to business, embezzling and framing partners or employees. He's in prison now, by the way. 15 to 20 for fraud. My mother gasped. Richard looked like he'd been punched. You could have found that out 10 years ago if you'd bothered to investigate instead of just assuming I was guilty. But that would have required admitting you were wrong about Jim. And more importantly, it would have required trusting me. I walked over to the window and looked out at the backyard where I'd spent so many afternoons as a teenager, learning to frame walls and pour concrete, where Richard had taught me to read blueprints and use a level properly, before everything went wrong. I built a good life, I said, without turning around. I built a business that matters, that creates homes for people, that employs hundreds of workers. I did it without your help, without your money, without your name. I did it starting with $500 and a determination to prove you wrong. Marcus, my mother whispered. I turned back to face them. But I didn't do it to prove you wrong. I did it because I love construction. I love building things. I love the challenge of taking raw materials and creating something beautiful and functional and lasting. You taught me that, Richard. Before you decided I was a thief, you taught me to love this work. Richard was crying now, ugly sobbing tears that shook his whole body. I'm sorry, he said. God, Marcus, I'm so sorry. I was scared. The money was missing and Jim was so convincing and I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Yes, I said, you did. Is there any way you could forgive us? Help us? I know we don't deserve it, but... I looked at this broken man, this shadow of the person who'd once loomed so large in my life. I thought about the scared, angry young man I'd been 10 years ago, driving away from this house with nowhere to go. I thought about all the nights I'd dreamed of this moment, imagined what I'd say, how I'd make them pay for what they'd done to me. But looking at Richard now, I realized I didn't need revenge. I'd already won. I'd built something they could never take away from me. I'll help, I said. Richard looked up in shock. You will. I'll pay off the judgment and the liens. I'll restructure your business debt. I'll bring in a management team to get the company back on track. But there are conditions. Anything. First, you retire completely. You sign over all ownership and management to me, and you walk away. You can keep the house and enough money to live comfortably, but you're done with construction. Richard nodded quickly. Yes, of course. Second, we're changing the company name. It's going to be Cole Construction, and it's going to operate according to my standards. No cutting corners, no skipped inspections, no compromised materials. Ever. Yes. Third, every employee gets a raise and better benefits. And every project includes proper soil analysis and engineering consultations. No exceptions. Whatever you want. I looked at my mother, who was still crying but trying to smile. And fourth, we start over, clean slate. I'm not your stepson anymore, Richard. I'm your business partner. Your boss, actually, if you can handle that. Richard wiped his eyes and nodded. I can handle it. Good. I pulled out my phone. I'll have my lawyer drop the papers and my accountant assess the financial situation. We'll have this sorted out within a month. My mother rushed over and hugged me, something she hadn't done in 10 years. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. I hugged her back. And for a moment I was a child again, before Richard, before the business, before everything got complicated. Just a son and his mother, but only for a moment. I need to get back to LA, I said, stepping away from the embrace. I have a conference call with investors at 6. Of course, she said. But Marcus, will we see you again? I mean, more than just business? I considered the question. 10 years of silence. 10 years of building a life without them. But also 10 years of carrying around the weight of their betrayal. The burden of proving them wrong. We'll see, I said, one step at a time. I shook Richard's hand, his was trembling slightly, and walked back to my car. As I drove away from the house, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw my mother standing in the doorway, waving. I felt empty. Not satisfied, not vindicated, not angry. Just empty. I'd gotten everything I'd ever dreamed of in this scenario. Their acknowledgement that they'd been wrong, their desperate need for my help, their complete dependence on my success. But it didn't feel the way I'd imagined it would. It felt like closing a door that had been open for 10 years. Finally, definitively closed. 3 months later, Cole Construction was back in business. We'd settled all the outstanding lawsuits, paid off the creditors, and taken on 2 new residential projects. I'd hired a local general manager to run the day-to-day operations, while I handled strategy and business development from LA. Richard kept his word. He stayed retired, spent his time working in his garden, and reading mystery novels. My mother called me every few weeks to chat about small things, the weather, what she was cooking for dinner, neighbors' gossip. We were rebuilding something, slowly and carefully. I drove up to Sacramento once a month to check on the business and have dinner with them. It wasn't the family I'd grown up dreaming of, but it was something. A connection, a second chance. And in my downtown LA penthouse, looking out at the city lights, I realized that forgiving them hadn't been about them at all. It had been about me, about finally letting go of the anger that had driven me for 10 years, about proving to myself that I was bigger than my worst moment, stronger than my deepest wound. I'd built a good life. Not just successful, but good. Full of meaningful work, real relationships, genuine accomplishments. I'd built it starting with $500 and a broken heart, and nobody could ever take it away from me. Not even the people who'd tried to destroy me in the first place. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, it's also learning how to forgive.